Well, I am happy today to introduce our speaker, Reverend Stephen Minnema. Reverend Minnema has spoken to us in the past on a variety of topics, including his work in Colombia and also on racism in the church. He is a retired Presbyterian minister who has also served as an interim minister for Lutheran churches in the area, and he's also taught courses on ethics and religious studies at Viterbo University. Currently, he's working on a book that looks at the prophetic spirit through history. And by the way, as many of you know, he's my husband too. So welcome, Steve.
That last factoid is the one I'm most proud of, I hope you know. Thank you for having me this morning and for the opportunity to talk with you on a subject that is near and dear to my heart. Several years ago, I was reading in the Hebrew Bible from the book of Deuteronomy, and Moses says this, "The Lord your God shall raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You shall heed such a prophet." So that set me wondering, has Moses' God kept that promise and raised up prophets in every new generation? And by using the word prophet here, I'm talking not about a foreteller, but about someone who is a fierce opponent of injustice and a bold advocate for human freedom and justice. So I started doing some research through history, and I've now, I don't know how many chapters I've written in my book about finding prophets through history, but the last one I came to was a French philosopher of the 18th century French Enlightenment, an atheist by the name of Denis Diderot. Eric Kramer is here. I saw him over here. He taught me how to say that last name, so I want to acknowledge my gratitude to Eric for saying that. But that discussion of Denis Diderot is relevant this morning for two reasons. First, Pastor Bruce told us that the French Enlightenment is part of the heritage of Unitarian Universalism. And so Diderot is one of those fierce voices that the kids were talking about this morning, and it's relevant for us to think about him. But the second reason you may know is that this is the start of Banned Book Week. And many of Diderot's books were banned and burned during his lifetime. And so that's another reason that we're here this morning. Denis Diderot was born in Langres, France in 1713 and died in Paris in 1784. He was born to a staunch Roman Catholic family. He was a mischievous young man, very bright but troublesome, a troublemaker. And so they did the thing that they thought would be best for him. They determined that he would become a priest. And he didn't mind that because he loved to read and study. So they set him on this course, and they even sent him to Paris to study in the Catholic institution there toward preparing for a priest. But I don't think he ever really intended to be a priest. He just loved to study and think. But somewhere along the road there in Paris, he met the philosopher. He didn't meet him, but he read the philosopher Voltaire. And through that experience, this young Denis Diderot experienced what I would like to call a call to become a public philosopher. And that call for Diderot looked something like this. My country needs to move forward. It needs to move into the modern era. What's holding it back is its devotion to all these old traditions. It needs more than anything to be guided by reason, the kind of reason that he found in England and that he wanted to bring to France as well. And so Diderot felt this calling to be a public philosopher to his country. And he set off on that mission. But France of the time was not exactly conducive to what he had to say. France was under the rule of a monarch. In fact, the French society at the time was a pyramid with three dimensions to it. At the top sat the monarch, who was thought to be appointed by God, no less, to rule the society. Under the monarch were the nobility and the clergy. And the broad base of the pyramid consisted, of course, of the peasantry, who did all the work and paid all the taxes. The others didn't even pay taxes. They cavorted around the royal palace. So this was not a society that was likely to be open to the message that Denis Diderot had to give. But I want to just quickly summarize his career and then come back to what I'm most particularly interested in, is his challenge to the church and its faith. Diderot's life could be divided into three sections. His young adulthood, when he felt this experience, this call to become a public prophet, a public philosopher. And during this period, he wrote several books against the church and against Christian faith that landed him in jail. Almost risked his life for that. During the second period of his life, he was so brilliant that they realized that they needed to release him from jail in order to do some constructive work. And as a result, they made him the chief editor of the French Encyclopedia, which is often considered the Bible of the French Enlightenment. This was a multi-volume effort, 17 volumes, that aimed at bringing reason to French society. And so the Encyclopedia was full of the most recent learnings on all sorts of subjects, so that French society in all of its dimensions could learn from this and then move the society forward. It was a wonderful effort, an enormous effort. He gave his life's energy to it. But there was a third section of his life as well. After he finished the Encyclopedia, then he realized that he had an opportunity to do what he really wanted to do, which was to write what he really felt and not what was being censored by all the censors in the society. And so he started writing a whole bunch of books that he planned to have published after his death. But that wasn't enough either. So he spent a lot of time writing anonymously, and some of his anonymous contributions, which we have later been able to figure out what he wrote, were some of his most prophetic efforts, in which he opposed the tax structure of his society, he opposed slavery, he opposed the colonial empire in these writings. So this was a marvelous prophetic spirit that was at work in Denis Diderot. But let me return to his atheism, because this is what interests me the most. Diderot looked at his society that was stuck in its devotion to tradition and not ready or able to move forward. And he realized that the foundation of this society, the linchpin that was holding this all together, was the church and its claim to possess a certain truth that gave it the authority to tell the society how it should operate. And so Diderot, as he looked at this situation, there were four things about the church and its conduct, its message, its behavior at the time that troubled him deeply. Four things that he knew had to be changed if France was to move forward. The first was, of course, the idea, supported by the Bible, I suppose, that the monarch was God's representative, and you don't challenge God's representative. And the whole society, as a matter of fact, this pyramid structure, the church believed, was what God wanted things to be. So Diderot knew that was a problem. The second problem that Diderot had with the church was that the church had historically and continued to support the monarch as it violently suppressed other forms of religious faith. And of course, one of the biggest ones was the suppression of the Protestants in France, the Huguenots, who were slaughtered. During the period of the French Civil War, when the Catholic monarch was slaughtering the Huguenots, Diderot said the whole nation was bathed in the blood of the pious slaughtering each other. And he knew that that had to stop if France was to move forward. And the third thing that he had against the church was that because of its conviction that it held certain truth, it felt itself legitimized in suppressing questioning, doubts, investigations into the nature of things, science. And so how could the society move forward if the church was always there, backed up by the monarch with censors, watching everything people thought and wrote? And the fourth problem Diderot had with the church is the most fun one of all, and that is that the church discouraged people from enjoying their lives, their bodies, their sexuality, their pleasures. How could the church, how could the society move forward as long as that held? So Diderot knew that he had to do something as a public philosopher to challenge this stranglehold that the church and its faith had on its society. And the thing that he settled on in many of his different writings was to keep hammering away at the fact that the church could not reasonably demonstrate that it had a certain truth. That all of the arguments that the church put forward were flawed, and that the church, in fact, was not in possession of a certain truth, giving it authority to do all these things in its society. So let me just give you one example among many that I could offer of the way Diderot challenged this. He had to be subtle, of course, because they were watching him all the time, reading his books, banning them. So he had to be careful. But in the early book that he wrote that got him in prison, he talks about the case of a man born blind. And basically he says, well, let's suppose that a Christian, a theologian, a priest or something, proposes to this man born blind that he ought to believe in God because of the great design in the world that obviously argues for the existence of God. The world is so well designed, the church argued, that argues for the existence of God. And Diderot says, well, what do you think a man born blind is going to make of that argument? First thing he's going to say is, I can't see the design because I'm blind. The second thing he's going to say, if it's such a great design, why was I born blind? Okay, so this is how Diderot worked. He challenged people to think more carefully about the arguments that the church's authority rested on, until he ultimately began to undermine that confidence, to weaken the church's authority, and to allow a new society to emerge. All right, now I want to argue three things about this, about Diderot's accomplishment here as an atheist philosopher. I want to say we need to celebrate him. I want to say we need to learn from him. And finally, I want to say we need to question him. So first of all, we need to celebrate him, because he indeed was one of those courageous voices that gave us the liberty that we've come to expect. The best biography of Diderot is entitled Denis Diderot and the Art of Thinking Freely. But what we need to remember, and the reason we need to hang on to these stories, is that in order to think freely, Denis Diderot almost paid for that with his life. His courage gave us what we take for granted: the possibility of thinking freely, of questioning deeply, of doubting. And we need to appreciate that. We need to learn from him too, because I don't need to tell you, as Unitarians, that we are still under the threat of religious institutions that think their possession of certain truth gives them the authority to voice their views on others. Are we not? So Diderot is a challenge to us to be vigilant whenever religious institutions assume that they have possession of a truth that gives them power over others. But then I think we also need to question Diderot, and especially his atheism. Because I think what happens in a situation like this, when you've got an immovable force like the church of Diderot's time, and then his coming up against it as an atheist, what happens is that as the church hardens into its position, the atheist can also harden into his position. And so he slips into being as certain of his atheism as the church is certain of its faith. And you know what happens then? The conversation stops. There's no more talking. There's no more learning from each other. There's no more growing. And this is a problem, I think, because one of the criticisms of the atheism that came out of the French Enlightenment, and this is a serious one, is that it disenchanted the world. That instead of being a sacred space that we need to love and cherish and receive with gratitude, the world became a bunch of objects that we can make use of, exploit, pollute, leading to the world that we're seeing today. So we need to celebrate Diderot, we need to learn from him, and we need to question him. So let me leave you with 3 questions that I think I'd like you to ponder. First of all, is it possible that the best way to understand atheists, such as Denis Diderot, is to see them in their context and to understand quite clearly which version of God they are rejecting? If I had been living at that time and wanted to be faithful to the vision of Moses for justice, I would have been an atheist like Diderot as well, because I would have to say the God that I see in the church is not a God I can live with, believe in, trust in. So we need to see atheism as a response to the assertion of a specific vision of God. Second question, is the struggle of atheism with established religion. In the struggle, is it possible to imagine a different outcome? Is it possible to imagine that the conversation, instead of stopping, continues? And it's a conversation in which Diderot says to the church, you can't be so certain. You can never be certain. Certainty isn't possible. In fact, certainty is demonic. Diderot would say that. But here's the rub. Diderot was troubled by his own atheism because it left him with no basis for hope. He couldn't find hope in his view of the world. And that's where a believer might come back to Diderot and say, okay, granted, we can't be certain, but don't we need to believe in something bigger than ourselves? Don't we have to ultimately rely on faith to believe that the world makes sense, that there's a force for justice working in the world? Don't we need to do that? And so you see, this conversation could get us to a new place if it could continue instead of being stopped. And then the last question I'd ask is something like this. Isn't this conversation needed by each and every one of us? Because deep in our souls, I believe maybe you think differently, but I propose this. I believe deep in our souls is a believer and an atheist. Someone who wants to trust, wants to believe, and someone who wants to be reasonable and has doubts. Isn't that true in every one of us? And so what we need is to see this conversation come to life again and maybe lead us to new insights. Thank you.